Barron Trump leaned back in his plush, high-backed chair at the exclusive Manhattan restaurant, swirling the last of his Cabernet Sauvignon as his sharp gray eyes swept across the dimly lit dining room. The polished marble floors reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, and the murmurs of Manhattan's elite hummed like background music. It was a world he had known all his life, a world of fine dining, impeccable service, and unspoken rules. But tonight, amidst the glittering facade, something, or rather someone, caught his attention. Emily. The young waitress moved swiftly between tables, balancing plates with practiced precision. Her hair, pulled back into a simple ponytail, shone under the chandeliers, but her tired eyes betrayed the weariness she fought to hide. Her uniform, a crisp white shirt and black slacks, was immaculate, but it clung to her like a weight. Barron noted the small tremor in her hands as she set down a plate of seared duck in front of an older couple who barely glanced up. Her smile was polite, professional, and yet, to him, it seemed like armor, something worn to shield whatever lay beneath. It was her voice, soft and trembling, that truly caught his ear. As the rush of dinner service began to subside, Emily approached the chef at the kitchen doors, her shoulders slightly hunched as if she were bracing herself. She kept her tone low, but Barron, seated near enough to catch snippets of the exchange, heard her quiet, almost desperate request. "Chef, do you mind if I take some of the leftovers home tonight? Just whatever's left after service. I'll make sure it's nothing anyone else can use." The chef, a stocky man with a booming laugh and a sharp temper, glanced at her, momentarily startled. "Leftovers? You mean the stuff we throw out? Sure, I don't care. Just don't make a habit of it, all right?" "Thank you," Emily replied, her voice almost breaking. She ducked her head and quickly returned to her duties, carrying trays with the grace of someone used to being invisible. Barron's curiosity was piqued. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze following her as she weaved through the restaurant. To anyone else, Emily might have seemed like just another waitress, competent, polite, and forgettable. But Barron had a knack for noticing the small details, and tonight he couldn't ignore the quiet strength she exuded. There was a determination in the way she carried herself, despite the fatigue that clung to her like a second skin. And then there was her request, simple but revealing. It wasn't just about food. It was about survival. Barron tapped a finger against the stem of his wineglass, a thoughtful expression settling over his features. He wasn't sure why he cared. He didn't make a habit of worrying about other people's struggles. But something about Emily felt different. She wasn't just enduring, she was fighting, though it was clear the battle was taking its toll. As the night wore on, Barron's attention rarely wavered from her. Every time she passed his table, he studied her movements, the set of her jaw, the way she adjusted her demeanor for different customers. She was an enigma wrapped in quiet resilience, and for reasons he couldn't yet articulate, he felt compelled to learn more. By the time Emily began clearing the last of the tables, Barron had made up his mind. He signaled to the waiter for the check, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He didn't know who Emily was, or why her struggles resonated so deeply with him. All he knew was that he couldn't leave the restaurant tonight without finding a way to understand her story. As he rose from his seat, he glanced one last time at Emily, catching the shadow of exhaustion on her face. Her world seemed so far removed from his, yet in this moment, their paths had crossed. And for Barron Trump, a man used to getting what he wanted, this intersection felt like the start of something important. The night air was cool as Barron Trump stepped out of the restaurant, his coat draped casually over his arm. The streets of Manhattan glittered, with life taxis honking, the glow of neon signs reflecting off puddles left from a light drizzle earlier in the evening. Barron wasn't entirely sure what had compelled him to linger by the curb, watching as Emily emerged from the staff entrance around the corner, her slim figure framed in the harsh glow of a street lamp. She hugged a worn messenger bag close to her side and carried a paper bag that likely contained the leftovers she'd requested earlier. Emily moved with purpose, her head down, shoulders hunched slightly against the city's chill. Barron hesitated for only a moment before making his decision. His driver, waiting by the sleek black town car parked nearby, gave him a questioning look, but Barron waved him off. "I'll walk." He kept a safe distance behind Emily, careful not to be noticed. Something about her had struck a chord deep within him, and now he was determined to understand why. She didn't take the subway. Instead, she walked several blocks, her pace steady, despite the evident fatigue in her step. The further she went, the less glamorous the city became. The glittering storefronts and upscale restaurants gave way to dimly lit streets, their sidewalks cracked and littered with yesterday's trash. The buildings here loomed darker, with peeling paint and barred windows. Barron felt the weight of the contrast, this life of opulence and hers of struggle. Finally, Emily stopped in front of a narrow, run-down apartment building. The metal security gate groaned in protest as she pushed it open and stepped inside. Barron waited across the street, observing the chipped facade, the flickering hallway light, visible through the smudged glass of the front door. He hesitated, unsure of his next move. His curiosity had brought him this far, but was it enough? His answer came moments later, when the light in a second-story window flickered on. Through the thin, yellowed curtains, Barron caught a glimpse of Emily, setting the paper bag down on a small... The room was modest, sparsely furnished, with mismatched pieces. A faded couch occupied one corner, and a small kitchen was visible in the back. Then, another figure appeared, a boy, no older than 6 or 7, darting into the... "Mommy!" the boy cried, launching himself into Emily's arms. She knelt to hug him, her face softening into a smile that erased some of the exhaustion Barron had seen earlier. She kissed his cheek and said something he couldn't hear, but the tenderness of the moment was unmistakable. Barron's chest tightened. This was the reality she returned to after long hours on her feet, a small apartment, and a son she clearly adored but struggled to support. He watched as she unpacked the leftovers, arranging them neatly on 2 plates. She handed one to the boy, who clambered onto the couch, eating hungrily while she sat beside him with her own meal. The scene was both heartbreaking and humbling. Barron, a man who had never known scarcity, couldn't imagine the weight Emily carried every... She worked tirelessly, not for herself, but for this child, for his survival, his happiness. It was a quiet heroism, one that no one in that high-end restaurant would ever have noticed. Barron turned away, his mind racing. He had seen enough to understand one thing. Emily's life was a constant fight, one she faced with quiet, and now that he had witnessed it, he couldn't simply walk away. Something about her struggles felt personal, like a challenge he hadn't yet decided how to. As he walked back toward his car, Barron resolved to find a way to help, not out of pity, but out of respect for the strength she didn't know she had revealed. Barron had thought he'd leave after following Emily home, that witnessing the quiet hardship of her life would be enough to satisfy the strange pull he felt toward. But as he stood in the shadows across the street from her apartment, something held him in place. Maybe it was the image of the young boy she'd hugged so tightly, or the way she'd carefully divided a small meal between herself and her son, eating with a kind of resignation that spoke of endless sacrifice. Whatever it was, Barron found himself lingering, almost against his own will. The faint glow of her apartment window flickered with movement. Barron shifted closer, drawn to the muted sounds of her life, the clinking of dishes being washed, the muffled hum of a child's laughter, and then, unexpectedly, a sound that stopped him. Emily was crying. Her sobs were muffled but unmistakable, raw in their honesty. Barron instinctively moved closer to the building, just beneath her second-floor window, careful not to make a... Her voice, trembling and broken, carried through the thin wall. She wasn't speaking to anyone directly. It sounded like a one-sided conversation, her words spilling out as if she could no longer contain. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm trying, Sam. I'm trying so hard, but it's never enough. The rent's due in a week, and I..." She broke off, a choked sob escaping. "I just want to give you a better life. You deserve so much more than this." Barron's heart clenched at her words. He could picture her in his mind, perhaps sitting on the edge of that worn couch, her face buried in her hands as she released the weight she couldn't let her son see. He could hear the pain in her voice, the sheer exhaustion of someone who had been running on empty for far too long. A child's voice interrupted her sobs. "Mommy, are you okay?" Emily sniffled, quickly composing herself. I'm fine, sweetheart. Go back to bed, okay? Barron stood frozen, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar ache. He had seen many things in his privileged life power. Wealth, influence, but this raw display of vulnerability struck something deep within. Emily's strength was immense, but even the strongest shoulders could buckle under such a burden. As he turned to leave, a new thought gripped. For the first time in his life, Barron felt the stirrings of responsibility, not out of obligation, but out of the quiet realization that he had the power to ease someone else's pain. Emily's burden was hers alone, but perhaps it didn't have to be. Barron Trump had never worked a day in his life, not in the way Emily did. His world had always been one of effortless abundance, a life of high-end boardrooms, trust funds, but something about Emily, her quiet strength, the weight of her struggles, and the raw honesty he'd overheard had stirred something inside him. He wanted to understand. And so, for the first time, Barron stepped into a world completely unlike his. The next morning, wearing an uncharacteristically plain black shirt and slacks, Barron walked into the restaurant's kitchen. He had arranged, through an anonymous donation and a few phone calls, to take a part-time position as a busboy. The irony wasn't lost on him. He, the billionaire's heir, wiping down tables and ferrying dirty dishes to the. Yet it felt oddly grounding, as though shedding the weight of his privilege was the only way to bridge the canyon of differences between his life and Emily. The work was grueling, even at half the hours Emily worked. The noise in the kitchen was constant, pans clanging, orders being shouted, the hiss of steam and the sharp tang of cleaning chemicals in the air. By the end of the first night, Barron's feet ached, his shirt clung to his back, and his hands were raw from scrubbing dishes. He began to understand why Emily's shoulders always seemed slightly hunched, her movements efficient but strained. But what struck him most was how much more Emily gave than the job demanded. She moved like a dancer, balancing heavy trays with practiced grace, her polite smile never faltering even under the rudeness of impatient customers. She picked up extra shifts without complaint, and when others lagged, she quietly stepped in to. Despite it all, he could see her exhaustion. In the moments she thought no one was looking, the way she leaned against the counter for a fleeting second, or rubbed her temples as though fighting a constant headache. During his breaks, Barron began to overhear the small things that painted the larger picture of Emily's life. She spoke sparingly about her son Sam, but it was clear he was her. Her co-workers mentioned how she never splurged on herself, every dollar going toward rent, food, and school supplies. There was a quiet heroism in the way she lived, a selflessness that left no room for indulgence. By the end of the week, Barron had gained more than just sore muscles. He had a newfound respect for Emily's resilience. She was fighting a battle he could barely fathom, yet she carried herself with unwavering dignity. He no longer simply admired her strength, he understood the cost. And now, more than ever, he was determined to help. But first, he needed to find a way that didn't rob her of the pride she had worked so hard to preserve. The evening was cool as Barron walked Emily home after her shift. The streets quiet except for the occasional hum of a passing car. Emily clutched her worn messenger bag, her usual composure softened by the unspoken bond that had been forming between. Barron wasn't sure how to explain his sudden presence in her life, but something about walking beside her felt right. As they turned onto her block, the faint sound of raised voices caught their attention. Barron's sharp gaze darted ahead, and he saw a small group of teenagers gathered near the entrance of Emily's apartment building. In the middle of them was Sam, his small frame stiff with fear, as two of the boys taunted him, shoving his shoulders and laughing cruelly. "Hey, what's this? Your mom's leftovers. Let's see if they taste good." One of the boys sneered, snatching the paper bag Sam clutched. "Stop it! Give it back!" Sam shouted, his voice trembling. But his defiance only fueled their laughter. Emily's breath caught, her face pale with panic, but before she could move, Barron was already striding forward. His commanding presence alone was enough to silence the group. "Hey!" His voice was sharp, cutting through the night. The teenagers froze, suddenly uncertain under Barron's steely glare. "Is this how you prove your strength? By picking on a kid?" The bullies muttered excuses and slunk away, the bravado drained from their posture. Barron crouched beside Sam, handing him the bag the boys had dropped. "You okay?" Sam nodded, his eyes wide with awe. Emily hurried over, pulling her son into her arms, her relief palpable. She looked at Barron, her gratitude unspoken but clear. In that moment, her walls began to crumble, and she allowed herself to trust. The dinner rush was just starting to fade when the front doors of the restaurant swung open with a sharp jangle of the bell. Barron, wiping down a table nearby, glanced up instinctively. A man stood in the doorway, his presence immediately commanding attention, not because he belonged, but because he so clearly didn't. His appearance was rough, disheveled. He wore a threadbare leather jacket, his eyes dark and searching. There was an intensity about him, a simmering anger that made the air feel heavy. Barron watched as the man strode purposefully to the hostess stand. "I'm looking for Emily," he growled, his voice low but edged with menace. The hostess hesitated, her usual polite professionalism faltering.
Emily? I'm not sure."
"Don't play dumb with me," the man snapped, leaning closer. "She works here, doesn't she? Tell her Tom's here, and I'm not leaving until I see." Barron's grip tightened on the cloth in his hand. He didn't need to guess who this man was. The name Tom was one he had overheard in hushed conversations between Emily and her coworkers, always spoken with a mixture of fear and disdain. This was Sam's estranged father, the man Emily had left behind, the man she had been running from. And now, somehow, he had found. Before the hostess could respond, Emily appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray of empty glasses. The moment her eyes landed on Tom, she froze, her face draining of. The tray wobbled in her hands before she set it down on the nearest table, her movements stiff and deliberate. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was calm, but Barron could see the fear in her eye. Tom smirked, a predatory grin that sent a chill through the room. "What? No warm welcome for your old man, Em? I've been looking for you for a long time. Figured it was about time I checked in on myself." Emily stiffened. "You have no—" "I have every right," Tom barked, his voice rising. Heads turned, the hum of the dining room quieting as diners began to take notice. "He's my kid, Emily. And you? You don't get to just disappear with him like—" Barron's instincts kicked in. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Emily and Tom.
"You need to leave,"
Barron said, his tone even but firm. "Now." Tom turned his attention to Barron, his eyes narrowing. "And who the hell are you? Her boyfriend? Stay out of this. It's none of your business." Barron didn't flinch. "It is." Tom stared him down for a moment, as if sizing him up. Then he scoffed, stepping back. "This isn't over," he said, pointing a finger at Emily. "You can't keep Sam away from me forever. I'll be—" With that, he turned and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him. The tension in the room lingered, the silence oppressed. Emily looked as though she might collapse, her shoulders sagging as she let out a shaky breath. Later that night, as Barron walked Emily and Sam home, she finally broke her silence. Sam had fallen asleep on her shoulder, his small hand clutching her sleeve, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. "I didn't think he'd find us," Emily said quietly, her voice trembling. "I've been so careful, changing jobs, moving apartments, keeping to myself. But he always finds a way. He always does." Barron walked beside her, his hands shoved into his coat pockets.
"What does he want?"
Emily hesitated before answering. "Control," she whispered. "He's always wanted control. Over me, over Sam. When we were together, he was cruel, manipulative. The first few years were fine, but once Sam was born, he became someone else, someone violent. I left when he hurt Sam for the first time. He was just a baby." Her voice broke, and she paused to steady herself. "I filed for a restraining order, but it doesn't stop him. It never does." Barron stopped walking, turning to face her. "You're not alone in this anymore, Emily." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know us." Barron's jaw tightened. "Because I do know you. I see how hard you fight for your son, how much you sacrifice. You deserve to feel safe, Emily, and I'm going to make sure you." When Barron returned to his penthouse later that night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at his desk. There was only one person he trusted with a problem like this: Vincent Blake, a former private investigator turned security consultant. Vincent had once helped Barron navigate a scandal that threatened his family years ago. Now, Barron needed his expertise for something far more personal. "Vincent," Barron said, when the call connected, I need your help. Over the next hour, Barron outlined the situation. Vincent listened intently, occasionally asking questions. When Barron finished, Vincent's response was simple. I'll take care. I'll find everything there is to know about this guy's whereabouts, his history, his weaknesses. We'll make sure he doesn't get anywhere near her or the kid. Barron leaned back in his chair, the weight on his shoulders easing just slightly. Thank you, Vincent. I owe you one. As he ended the call, Barron felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about protecting Emily and Sam. It was about standing up for something bigger than himself. Tom might have been a threat, but Barron was determined to be the wall that stood between him and the family he had no right to. Emily and Sam's battle had become his own, and he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever.